This is the Discovery Files podcast from the U.S. National Science Foundation. I'm Nate Potker. Welcome to a very special live episode where we're going to explore a wide variety of space topics and take some of your questions with Dr. Joe Pesce, astrophysicist, educator, and a program director in the Division of Astronomical Sciences at the U.S. National Science Foundation. Dr. Pesce, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me, Nate. I'm pleased to be here.
So some of our audience might know you from previous appearances where we've talked to you about the James Webb Space Telescope images and black holes. And what they might not know is, what do you do here as a program director?
So my job is that I'm the program director responsible for the National Radio Astronomy Observatory. And that is an organization that operates and maintains most of our radio astronomy observatories, both here in North America, and we have one facility in South America called ALMA. The ones in North America are called the Very Large Array in central New Mexico, and the Very Long Baseline Array, which is an observatory with antennas spread throughout the continental U.S. and beyond. And so my day-to-day job is probably kind of boring. I make sure that the NRAO it gets the resources that it needs, both financially and other non-financially, in order to run these observatories for us. Then they're open to anyone to apply for time observing with the telescopes. Anyone who has a great idea can submit that idea as a proposal. They submit it to the managing organization, and it goes through peer review. And if it's meritorious, then the telescope observes.
Excellent. So one of the facilities or telescopes you talked about is in northern Chile. We call it ALMA. What is ALMA, and what sort of work specifically happens there?
So ALMA is an acronym. We like acronyms, and that stands for the Atacama Large Millimeter Submillimeter Array. And as its name implies, it's a radio telescope, radio observatory, observing in the millimeter and submillimeter wavelength range of the electromagnetic spectrum. And it's an international organization, North America, National Science Foundation, and our partners in Canada and East Asia, along with Europeans, provide the yearly annual support for this observatory. It's a relatively new observatory. We just celebrated earlier this year the 10th anniversary of the end of construction. And it's a very powerful instrument. There are 66 antennas that operate together as a so-called interferometer. The widest spacing is about 16 kilometers, so it simulates a large single-dish radio telescope of 16 kilometers in diameter, which means it can see very fine detail on the sky. And it's observing in a part of the electromagnetic spectrum that we've had instruments before in the past, and other instruments observe in that frequency range, but not with such good instrumentation and large facilities such as ALMA. So it's making fantastic observations of mostly cold gas in the universe, material that's left over after stars form and is actively forming planets around those stars, so-called circumplanetary nebula. And it observes cold gas in galaxies to understand how that gas turns into stars and how stars are formed, and more distant objects. So not only is it observing the cold gas in nearby objects, including objects in our solar system, in fact, and the sun, the outer atmosphere of the sun, but it's also observing very distant objects, because we have this concept in astronomy that because the universe is expanding, very distant objects are moving away from us, and their light is being shifted into the red or redder than where it was emitted, fundamentally. And so for very, very distant objects, that light that might have been visible, or ultraviolet light when it left the object, over a vast amount of time, has shifted into the frequency range that ALMA can observe. So therefore, it's observing very distant objects as well. And with the advent of the JWST, the James Webb Space Telescope, they are making observations together, as do many other telescopes and observatories. But ALMA is particularly useful for JWST observations of all objects in general, but certainly distant objects in particular.
Another one of the facilities that it's currently under construction. It's not actually open yet, I believe, and maybe you can correct me on that if I'm misunderstanding, but the Verisi Rubin Observatory, expected to go online next year, I believe. What new capabilities will it have, and what sort of data will we be getting that we aren't currently?
Yeah, so the Rubin Observatory, as you say, is currently under construction, and it'll be a year or so before it turns on. It's a completely different sort of observatory in many ways. Primarily, it's observing in the visible part of the electromagnetic spectrum. That is the part that we see with our eyes, more or less. The game-changing nature of the Rubin Observatory is that it's designed to take large-scale images such that it will observe the entire night sky over a period of about the entire night sky visible to that observatory, and it's in northern Chile as well. It'll take about 4 nights to do this, and then it starts over again and just continues to map, to observe all of the sky visible from that particular location. And so what does that mean? It means that it will be sensitive to objects that vary in brightness, either objects that we know about that because of their nature, certain types of stars, for example, that pulsate in brightness and they get brighter and fainter. Well, the Rubin Observatory will observe these and detect new ones, but it will also detect objects that we call transients. That is, they flash into existence and then may disappear after a couple of seconds or a couple of minutes or an hour or so. So what are these things that we know that there are these sorts of objects? Exploding stars called supernovae. They become very, very bright when they explode, some of the brightest objects in the universe. And so, they explode, they become very bright, they stay bright for weeks or months, and then they fade out. And we detect these, but, most astronomical observations today, currently, we're looking at a very small patch on the sky. So it's as if we were looking down a straw, right? So we're seeing just a very small area. And lots of neat things there, right? But who knows what's happening all around us? Well, Rubin will be finding the stuff that's all around us that we know a little bit that, some of them are going to be there, but most of the objects, I think, that Rubin will detect are unknown objects that we've never seen before. And asteroids, it will discover asteroids, it will discover supernovae, it'll discover new phenomenon that we can't even contemplate, today. And some indications are that it might be detecting 1 million to 10 million per night of these so-called transient objects. And then the intent is that if they're a really interesting class of object, then we might want to observe with other telescopes immediately, right? So an alert will be sent out, and space telescopes and other ground-based telescopes will move to that particular location and try to determine what the phenomenon is. And so this is again game-changing.
Right.
We've never really had this large-scale, wide-scale capability, and I'm really quite excited about what Rubin will observe.
And being able to look at kind of the time scale involved with that much data and just the changes that happen over time. Like it'll probably be easier in a way to track things that are developing, like you said, things that just appear suddenly or disappear suddenly.
Yes, that's right. And the point that you've just made that I glossed over is, you can expect that 1 to 10 million objects a night is a lot of data, but those are the kind of the objects that need to be alerted. Mm-hmm. It's observing the entire night sky, so there's huge amounts, petabytes of data that will be fed into an archive, petabytes per year, 15, 20, maybe more.
It's amazing.
And so that archive, in addition to these, fast response observations that we will need to make on newly discovered objects, the archive will be stunning. I work on a class of object that are called blazars. They are jets of material coming from supermassive black holes the jets are aimed more or less directly at us. And we know some, I don't know, 300, 500 of these objects that we've been studying for the last 30 years. I expect that in the Rubin archive, there'll be millions of them. And so, just in that area alone, we'll have huge amounts of larger samples and much more data that, we'll be able to, astronomers of the future will be able to go into that archive and do a lot of work in astronomy. It's going to also take kind of a different educational background for astronomers to be able to interact with these large data sets in a way that we've not had available to us before.
One of the other facilities I wanted to ask you about was the Carl G. Jansky Very Large Array. And there was a news headline that probably many of us saw this year about it joining the hunt for extraterrestrial life. So, which for me raises a couple questions where I'm wondering what you're looking for exactly. And what are they looking for?
So these are observations that piggyback off of observations that are taking place, astronomical observations that are taking place. So the Very Large Array is this array of 27 antennas in central New Mexico, and again, it's an interferometer, so they are all observing the same patch of sky more or less to simulate a much larger single dish radio telescope. And so, they may be observing a quasar or one of my blazars, right? And the equipment that is searching for extraterrestrial signals sits there and records the data stream, for lack of a better way of saying it. And so they're not particular pointed observations for that experiment to search for extraterrestrial intelligence. It's just using the same data, but then also looking in, the field of view to see if there's something there. And what they're trying to pick up is communication signals, or maybe I should say more generically, non-natural radio emission. So, if you were looking at Earth, you would pick up military radars, and you would pick up, television broadcasts and FM radio transmissions. And, for a planet like the Earth, well, frankly, if you can't even see the planet and you're observing the sun from a distance, right? For an object like the sun, that sort of radio transmission is not natural. The sun and planets do emit radio frequencies, but not of the sort that are coming from, our terrestrial, human-made radio transmissions. And so, if we're sitting, 100 light years away from the sun, and we're picking this up, we would question, hey, what's going on there at that particular location in the universe? And so that's what these SETI, Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, observations are doing. There are other sorts. I don't think this particular experiment is doing that, but there's a growing project to search for what we call technosignatures. So these are not necessarily beamed transmissions or even unbeamed transmissions, radio transmissions, but these are maybe, from an advanced alien civilization, they have technology that's absorbing electromagnetic radiation from their star, and it heats up and it emits radiation in infrared, and that radiation may be anomalous. And so if we can detect that might be an indication of alien technology. So that's called technosignatures. But the SETI project at the VLA is, again, listening for most likely passive transmissions, if they are out there, rather than an alien intelligence beaming a signal to us. That's highly unlikely. But these passive signals, like the radio transmissions that are coming from the Earth, that certainly may be possible. And we have not detected that to date, but the experiment that's taking place at the VLA is just the continuation of of those sorts of SETI searches.
And I think for the audience that are watching right now, that facility made an appearance in the Jodie Foster film Contact, where they did speak with extraterrestrials, if I'm recalling correctly. Kind of following on that topic, I want to ask you to put on your astronomer hat for a second. And do you personally think there's life outside our solar system, or possibly even on other planets within our solar system? And if so, are we thinking about it in the wrong way when we're imagining fantastic creatures? Is it more likely to be microbes or something?
Well, so I'll get to that answer, but first I want to set the context. And right, we only know of life in one location, right here on Earth, and so when we look for life, we think that if there is life elsewhere, it'll follow a very similar model to life on Earth. And so that kind of informs what we're looking for, right? Life requires oxygen and water, and there are certain ways that cells produce energy biochemically. And, we kind of understand how life on Earth does that sort of stuff. And it seems like in nature, that's a logical way to do things. And so when we look for life, we're looking for life that's not necessarily like us, but like stuff that we know on Earth. So that's the ground truth there. That's the caveat that we put with this. Could be that life operates completely differently somewhere else, and then the question is, well, would we necessarily recognize that? And so that's a debatable question, and it also argues for looking for other forms of life that may not be like we know it, but that's much harder. So let's start with life like we know it. So your question is a great one. It's the single most common question I get. I would say but the answer is complicated, right? So I would say that simple one-celled life is probably very common outside of the Earth, maybe even in our solar system, as you point out. Could be on Mars. It could be in these under ice oceans on the satellites of Jupiter and Saturn. There are a number of satellites there that are relatively large that have thick ice shells underneath of which are liquid water that we know from spacecraft observations, and new observations of some of these show that it's a briny ocean, which is that salt, the potassium and the sodium that we're detecting is important for life again as we know it. Okay, so why do I say that single cell life is likely common? Because on Earth, when we look back in the history of the Earth, early life forms, which were single-celled and very simple life forms, pop up almost immediately after the Earth's surface cools and solidifies. And when the Earth was forming, it was molten, magma was all over the place, just from the formation. And then for a period of time, the Earth was bombarded by, huge asteroids, material left over from the formation of the sun and other planets. And so all of that bombardment was such that the surface was basically liquid rock for quite some time. But almost immediately after that surface solidified, we see the emergence of things like blue-green algae and that sort of stuff. So, is it coming together from material on the Earth? Is it coming from outside of the Earth and being seeded onto the surface of the Earth? Either way, it's popping up very rapidly. And we also know about life forms, simple life forms, that can exist in extreme environments, in the vacuum of space, in very high temperatures, in very high pressures, in deep inside solid granites and that sort of thing. And they operate a little bit differently than this life that we see on the surface, but nonetheless, we know that exists. And, those conditions are like in other planets. So I think it's highly likely that, bacteria and blue-green algae is everywhere.
Makes sense.
Then you get to life like us, right? Advanced intelligent life. And I wouldn't be surprised, but the probability, I think, drops off rapidly, again, from the same argument, right? Look how long it took for intelligent life to appear on the Earth. And even if you say, dinosaurs were intelligent, and I think that they probably are, because we look at the dinosaurs that are with us today, birds, right? Birds are highly intelligent. Even given that, and dinosaurs lived a long time ago, that's still a very short time frame in the history of the Earth. And so just based on that probability, the likelihood of intelligent species is lower, but the universe is a big place and the universe is very old. And so I would be surprised if there isn't intelligent life out there as well. Just a little bit lower probability, I think. I will also add that I think it's highly unlikely that they are zipping around in spacecraft visiting the Earth. So I think that's probably not the case.
Right. Right. I wanted to ask you about one of these terms that I've seen floated around quite a lot lately that I sort of have an understanding of, but not quite. And this term is multi-messenger astronomy. What is that?
That's it. So, so astronomy is all about messengers, right? We are an indirect science. So I can't go to the laboratory and look at my single-celled amoeba, right? Or my blue-green algae on the microscope and play around with it and dissect it or whatever, right? So, there is laboratory work in astronomy, and that's basically understanding, what sort of molecules exist in space, and we can make those molecules. But the vast majority of astronomy is an indirect science. I can't go to my distant blazar and with my Starship Enterprise and study it locally. So everything is indirect. So we rely on messengers, and for the vast history of astronomy, the messenger that we used was light, photons. So visible light photons that our eyes detect, infrared photons that we feel as heat, radio photons that the observatories we talked about earlier, the VLA and ALMA, are picking up, X-rays and gamma rays. Those are all photons, electromagnetic radiation. And so that's a type of messenger. But now we have the advent of other messengers, and one of them is gravitational waves. The NSF's LIGO observatory, the Laser Interferometry Gravitational Wave Observatory, came online in 2017, 2018, is now detecting gravitational waves from moving masses. In the case of LIGO, it's colliding, merging black holes, merging neutron stars. Future gravitational wave observatories will be sensitive to merging supermassive black holes and other, again, large masses that change the fabric of space. And we detect those as gravitational waves. So now we have photons and gravitational waves as messengers. And then we also have particles. Cosmic rays are high energy protons and electrons that are coming from the sun and much more distant astronomical objects. My object that I studied, the blazars, with that jet of material. What is that material? It's protons and electrons being squirted out of the region near the supermassive black hole at very near the speed of light. And we detect some of these particles. Neutrinos are these very light particles that are produced in supernova explosions and in the fusion process. And we can detect them with observatories like IceCube in the Antarctic. And IceCube is a detector that sits under the ice, and as these particles come up through the ice, it detects them. And so this is another messenger. So now in astronomy, we have three messengers: the particles, the gravitational waves, and the photons. And so that's what we call multi-messenger astronomy.
I had intended to ask you as my closing question about LIGO and the gravitational waves kind of reading. And part of that was, you mentioned the collision of the black holes. So what happens to the black holes when they collide with each other?
Well, so that they have to be very close. And so they started out these are so-called stellar-sized black holes that are the product of massive stars, much larger than the sun, ending their life and exploding catastrophically in this thing that we call a supernova. And one of the end possibilities that's left over is a black hole that's 5 to, 30 times the mass, 50 times the mass of our sun. And so stars can form in multiple star systems. Maybe you have two stars that have formed together and they're gravitationally bound. They're about the same mass because mass dictates the lifetime of a star. And, they both explode as supernovae, and now you have two black holes left over. They're orbiting each other. Over time, they're losing energy for a variety of reasons, and they start to spiral in. Their orbit around each other gets smaller and smaller. And as they spiral in, there may be some subset of those objects that get so close that they collide. And what happens is they merge and form a larger black hole than the two, than the two individual ones. So, you might have 220 solar mass black holes. They in-spiral. When they merge, they release a little bit of gravitational energy, so they may lose a couple of solar masses, and then they end up with like a 38 solar mass black hole. And it's an individual black hole. Well, that process, as they're spiraling around each other, remember, they're a very dense, they are deforming space-time significantly. And as they orbit around, they're releasing energy in the form of gravitational waves that travel through the fabric of space, and then LIGO detects them. And so typically what we see is the gravitational waves as they're in-spiraling, and then when they merge, they kind of, as a single object, they kind of wobble. The merged black hole kind of wobbles, and it sends out ripples, and so we see those ripples, and then the gravitational waves die off, or at least we're not able to detect them once that kind of settles down. So that's what LIGO is detecting at the moment. That sort of process, either in gravitation, in black holes, or in spiraling neutron stars, does the same thing.
Very cool. So as we head towards the end of our conversation today, I wanted to hit you with a couple pop culture, more fun, light topics. And we'll start with one of the scariest space movies of all time. Alien had the catchphrase, "In space, no one can hear you scream." Is this true? And if so, why?
So yes. And it's because, remember, we say that space is a vacuum, and which means that there's basically nothing there, or it's very, very low density. And sound, I'm transmitting sound now, and it's being picked up by my microphone and turned into electric signal. But sound is the compression of, in our case, the atmosphere, right? There's a medium around us, which is the atmosphere. And sound is compression waves that travel from my mouth, from my vocal cords, through the room to a listener's ear. And in a vacuum, there's no medium to transmit those compression waves. So you can't hear in space. You can't hear screams as you're being eaten by a horrible alien.
So following up from there, the sound waves can't travel, but we get radio waves. What is the difference that's happening there?
So the problem here is terminology, right? And when I say radio, to the vast majority of people, they think they're FM radio or Spotify or whatever, and we listen to a radio, right? So the stereo is on and it's creating sound in the speakers, and that sound compression waves are coming to our ear. So that's what we call radio. But when we're talking about radio from an astronomical perspective, we're talking about the radio portion of the electromagnetic spectrum. It's not sound that we're hearing. It's just low energy electromagnetic radiation, photons with very long wavelengths and very low energy. So they're two completely different topics, but it's important to realize that a radio astronomer, or an astronomer that's using radio photons from the electromagnetic spectrum, we are not picking up sounds. We are picking up light that happens to be very low energy.
Awesome.
And that we call radio.
Thank you.
Yes.
So you've mentioned in the past being a Star Trek fan, so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about this. one of the things that other people that work around space topics, they've all talked about the impact of the technology specifically in the various Star Trek shows. So what do you feel as someone who watched those shows, seeing some of these things like quantum drives and plasma devices becoming real things?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite amazing, right? And so I think, so yes, you mentioned I'm a Star Trek person, and the original series, by the way. I mean, I like them all, but it was the original series that got me started. And I'm where I am because of Star Trek. So I owe it a big debt of gratitude. So there's that aspect of it, right? That Star Trek has inspired, and science fiction in general has inspired lots of scientists to become scientists. And so, we shouldn't underestimate that, because, think of all the scientific discoveries or whatever that, we don't even know about, that have occurred because a person, when they were 5 years old, was watching Star Trek and became a scientist. Not me, I'm necessarily saying, but there's lots of us out there, right? But to your point about the technology, I think, that's a testament to the creators and the writers of science fiction in general, and Star Trek in particular, that they did have that far-seeing vision. I mean, right? We have things like this. That's
your tricorder right there.
Well, when Star Trek came about in the mid '60s, that would have been magic if I plopped down with my time machine, and that was all foreseen. But however, once something like that is transmitted, right? So obviously the writers are have a vision, and that's all fantastic, and that's a genius. But of course, once it's out there in the wild, right, it's a chicken or egg question. So I might have seen I'm an engineer, and I might have seen an episode of Star Trek 20 years earlier, and it had some sort of tech that I vowed to develop, and if I hadn't seen that, maybe I wouldn't have. And so there's there's a lot of bootstrapping going on, but absolutely, I think it's fabulous, and a lot of the technology that we see, and certainly in like the original series, has come to fruition in many ways. Sadly, not warp drive yet, and so we're not zipping around the galaxy at faster than light travel, which frankly is what we're going to need to be able to go to these large distances, even the nearest star in anything that is reasonable for human life scale, let's say.
So you mentioned a affinity for the original series. Do you think it's the best?
Yeah, I think so. Yes.
All right. So final question. Impact of current sci-fi on future generations. Do you think it'll resonate in the same way in the future?
I think so, right? So we're, when you compare now to the mid '60s, right, we're a much more technically and technologically savvy society. And so, I guess you could debate whether the influences would be as large or it's going to be incremental. On the other hand, think about 50 years in the future, and there's going to be things that, we can't even contemplate today. And so, yeah, I think science fiction, I think that's the great thing about science fiction. There's many great things about it, right? It's a genre that's very thought-provoking and interesting on its own. But I think for me, the importance of it is that it's inspiring. And, anything that we can do to inspire people to think about science and technology, whether they are going to go into science and technology or not, I think that's an important thing.
All right. I'm going to add one final question I got forwarded from one of our viewers, and I didn't catch the name here, but would you be a yellow shirt or a blue shirt? Or red shirt, I guess. They didn't even mention that one.
So I don't know. I suppose, by background, probably a blue shirt, although as I've gone through life, I might be more of a yellow shirt. Everyone's worried about the red shirts. dying on a distant planet. But statistically, you know, that's kind of a fallacy, because statistically it's not, it's a myth. So I probably wouldn't mind being a red shirt, but the affinity is more in the science realm. And then, I do leadership and management now. And so probably a yellow shirt at this point in my career.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And special thanks of all of you for tuning in and submitting your questions. For the Discovery Files, I'm Nate Potker. Please subscribe wherever you get podcasts. And if you like our program, share with a friend and consider leaving a review. Discover how the U.S. National Science Foundation is advancing research at nsf.gov.